Hello everyone. In this video, we cover the topic on World War One. I wish to begin it now. The story of First World War does not begin with a battlefield or a gunshot. It begins quietly in the years before 1914, when Europe looked powerful and stable on the surface, but underneath it was becoming increasingly fragile. Nations were growing stronger, economies were expanding, and empires were at their peak. Yet, behind this appearance of progress, tensions were building in ways that most people did not fully understand. One of the biggest changes during this time was the rise of militarism. Countries across Europe began to believe that having a strong military was not just important, but necessary for survival. Germany and Britain in particular entered into an intense competition to build the most powerful navy in the world. Armies grew larger, weapons became most advanced, and military planning became a central part of government strategy. War was no longer seen as a last resort. It was being prepared for as an inevitability. At the same time, Europe had divided itself into two major alliance systems. Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy formed what was known as Triple Alliance. On the other side, Britain, France and Russia came together as Triple Entente. These alliances were originally designed to maintain balance and prevent conflict. However, they had opposite effect. They turned Europe into a tightly connected system where a conflict between two countries could quickly pull in many others. Beyond Europe, competition for global influence was intensifying. The major powers were expanding their empires across Africa and Asia, competing for land, resources, and control. The imperial rivalry created constant tensions as each nation sought to increase its power and status. The world was becoming more interconnected but also more competitive and unstable. Inside Europe, another power was rising: the nationalism. People were becoming deeply loyal to their nations, often believing that their country was superior to others. In some regions, especially in the Balkans, nationalism took more dangerous form. Different ethnic groups wanted independence and the right to govern themselves. This created ongoing conflicts, particularly between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. The Balkans became known as the power keg of Europe because of how easily tensions there could ignite into violence. By the early 20th century, Europe had become a continent filled with pressure. Militarism had armed it, alliances had connected it, imperialism had divided it, and nationalism had stabilized it. All it needed was a single spark. The spark came on June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated by a nationalist with ties to Serbia. The event itself was shocking, but it was not the assassination alone that caused a world war. It was the reaction that followed. Austria-Hungary, holding Serbia responsible, declared war. Russia stepped in to support Serbia. Germany backed Austria-Hungary. France aligned with Russia and Britain soon joined in. Within weeks, the alliance system that was meant to maintain peace and had instead triggered a massive conflict. What began as a regional crisis quickly turned into a global war involving multiple continents and millions of soldiers. The systems that were supposed to protect Europe had ensured that it would fall into one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The First World War had begun, but in many ways it was not a sudden event. It was the result of years of tension, competition, and decisions that had slowly pushed the world towards the edge. And once the edge was crossed, there was no turning back. When the First World War began in 1914, it was not expected to become a long and devastating global conflict. Most leaders believed the war would be short, perhaps lasting only a few months. But what followed was a prolonged and brutal struggle that pulled in nations from across the world. On one side were the Central Powers led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and later joined by Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. On the other side stood the Allied powers, primarily Britain, France, Russia, with many other countries gradually joining, including Italy and eventually the United States. What started as a European conflict quickly expanded into a global war involving millions of soldiers from colonies and distant regions. Germany's strategy at the beginning of the war was fast and aggressive. It launched an invasion of Belgium and moved towards France, aiming to capture Paris quickly. This plan, known as Schlieffen Plan, was designed to defeat France before turning to face Russia in the east. However, the advance was stopped at the First Battle of Marne in 1914, where France and British forces managed to halt the German push just outside Paris. The moment changed the nature of the war completely. Instead of quick victory, the Western Front turned into a long static battlefield. Both sides dug deep trench systems stretching from North Sea to Switzerland. Soldiers lived in harsh conditions, facing constant artillery fire, mud, disease, and other psychological strain of waiting for attacks that could come at any moment. Battles were no longer about rapid movement, but about holding ground at immense human cost. One of the most devastating battles of the war was Battle of Verdun in 1916. Germany launched a massive attack on the French fortress city of Verdun, hoping to weaken France by forcing it into prolonged defensive struggle. The battle lasted for months with relentless artillery bombardment and repeated assaults. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded, yet the front lines barely moved. Verdun became the symbol of endurance, but also of the terrible cost of modern warfare. In the same year, the Battle of Somme was fought by British and French forces against Germany. It began with a massive artillery bombardment, followed by an infantry advance that resulted in catastrophic losses on the first day alone. Over time, the battle introduced new technologies, including tanks, but like Verdun, it resulted in enormous casualties with limited territorial gain. Together, these battles demonstrated how the war had become a struggle of attrition, where victory depended on which side could endure more loss. On the Eastern Front, the war was more fluid. Germany fought against Russia, achieving significant victories such as Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, where Russian forces suffered heavy losses. Despite these successes, the Eastern Front remained unstable. Over time, the internal problems within Russia, including economic hardship and political unrest, weakened its ability to continue fighting in 1917, the Russian Revolution forced Russia to withdraw from the war entirely, allowing Germany to shift its focus back to the Western Front. While Europe was the main battlefield, the war also extended to other regions. The Ottoman Empire fought in the Middle East, and campaigns such as Gallipoli saw Allied forces attempt to secure strategic post positions but ultimately failed. Colonies in Africa and Asia also became battlegrounds, making this a truly global conflict. As the war continued, both sides suffered massive losses. Millions of soldiers died, and entire towns and cities were destroyed. Industrial regions were devastated, infrastructure collapsed, and economies were strained to their limits. The scale of destruction was unlike anything the world had seen before. By 1917, the situation began to shift. Germany had been fighting on multiple fronts for years, and its resources were becoming stretched. At the same time, the United States entered the war on the side of the Allies. This brought the fresh troops, resources, and industrial strength, giving the Allies a significant advantage. Germany attempted one final major offensive in 1918, hoping to win the war before American forces fully arrived. Initially, it gained ground, but the advance could not be sustained. The Allies regrouped and launched a counteroffensive, pushing German forces back. Gradually, it became clear that Germany was losing the war. Inside Germany, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The economy was under strain. Food shortages were widespread and public morale was collapsing. Soldiers on the front lines were exhausted and support for the war was fading. At this point, German leaders began to realize that victory was no longer possible. For the Allies, the turning point came when their coordinated offensives began to succeed and German resistance weakened. The balance had shifted decisively. Victory was no longer uncertain, it was becoming inevitable. In November 1918, Germany agreed to an armistice, effectively ending the fighting. The war was over, but the consequences were immense. Around 16 million people had died, including soldiers and civilians. Entire regions were left in ruins and economies were shattered. Both the winning and losing sides suffered deeply, but the defeated nations, especially Germany, faced additional consequences that would shape the future. Even as the war ended, many questions remained. Could such destruction have been avoided? And more importantly, would the peace that followed bring stability or would it create new problems? The answer to those questions would come in the years ahead as the world moved towards the Treaty of the Versailles.